All right, welcome to this week's class. This week, we're going to look at usability testing, which is a pretty important part of the whole kind of design process. And interestingly, the terminology that we use, usability testing, sounds a lot like user testing and user interviews, which we did at the early part of the semester. But actually, that terminology refers to a very specific process. So usability testing, even though the name's very similar to user testing, is not exactly the same thing. So let's kind of dive in, and I'm going to give you an overview of usability testing. We're going to look at the components of a usability test, and then look at tips for how to go about designing your usability test. So the first thing is, what is usability testing? So it's the process of determining just how effectively and efficiently users are able to complete their tasks and meet their goals when interacting with a design prototype. As I mentioned before, usability testing is different to user testing. So user testing is something that you do in the initial discovery phase of your project when you're trying to understand the context of the design problem. Usability testing specifically refers to the point in your development where you've already created a prototype and now you're trying to ascertain just how effective that prototype is. So you're testing the product that you've created. And based on your testing and the results, you will iteratively develop and hone your design until you finally deliver the final project. So why do we do usability testing? So the first part, and this is really critical, we talked a lot in UX design, particularly at the start of UX design, about the need for UX research because we need to validate our assumptions. So you can't design, it's not good enough to just design things based on assumptions that you've made about how something should be. You have to really have evidence to prove that this is really the most effective way to design that thing. So this is where you learn about how others think and feel about the design. Also, it's where we identify specific components of the design that need adjusting or refining to improve their usability. And this is the process where we determine what works and what doesn't work. We uncover problems and opportunities, but also I think it's important to say that you also work out what's worked well, and you continue to do the things that work well, and don't kind of refine and iterate and just throw things out because you think that you're trying to do something new. It should be building on the successes of the things that are already there and working out where things could be improved and how they could get better. When do we do usability testing? During the testing phase. So for many of you, in terms of your project developments, you're probably at the stage, hopefully now, well into the prototyping stage. And that phase 3 and phase 4, as I've kind of alluded to in the past, it's not a linear process. There's a kind of a cyclical, iterative process where you prototype, you test, and then you improve, and then you just go on that loop. If you're really lucky, you have a lot of time for that loop, but generally speaking, you don't have a lot of time. In the case of where your projects are at, probably you're looking at 1 or 2 weeks worth of iteration before finishing off the project. Now, it's really important when you do your usability testing to make sure that your functional prototype closely reflects what your intended look and feel of your final project is. So it needs to be representative, because if you're showing something that's really low fidelity, you're not going to get all of the kind of feedback that you need necessarily. There might be some gaps in people's understanding or interpretation of how your product is supposed to work or how the product is supposed to look. So it's really ideal when you're going to do some really rigorous usability testing to do it with a prototype that is reflective of the final project. And it's really critical to ensure that your project schedule accounts for the time that you need to iterate and improve upon this. So it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be something that's sort of built into your schedule, all 4 phases of your design cycle. Now, the core elements of usability testing, when you boil it down to its most kind of simple components, is you've got the facilitator. Now, the facilitator basically guides the participant through the test process. In formal usability testing, like for those of you who go on to work in the UX industry as UX researchers, there's actually another role. So there's a facilitator and then there's the observer, and usually they're 2 different people. And there's a number of logistical reasons for that, but in the case of the university context, for all of you that are working on projects, you're basically the facilitator and the observer all in one. Okay? So I've got some tips for you on how to approach that to make sure that you have the objectivity that otherwise in a professional role, having two separate people doing that, there's certainly advantages of being approaching the process in a more objective way. Then there's the participant on the other side, right? So this is basically someone who's a realistic user, who's a representative of your target audience, someone who might actually use the real version of the app or the website that you're developing. And then the thing that drives the usability testing forward are the tasks that you set. Now these tasks need to be realistic activities that a target audience or a user group might actually want to do and use that product or that app or that website for. So these are the kind of the core ingredients, I guess you could say, for usability testing. Now there are two main modes of usability testing. So in person. So for many of you, given that we've been very fortunate in Perth to have very little restrictions in terms of the COVID thing, and classes are face-to-face for most of the semester. Ideally, doing an in-person usability test is the kind of pathway that you should be, hopefully, taking with your project. But there might be reasons where remote usability testing is actually advantageous. So maybe your product that you're designing has very specific user groups or a target audience that maybe you can't find representative users in your locality, and then remote testing becomes a kind of an important idea. So the key difference between in-person and remote is that in-person is where you're face-to-face, and then remote is online, as it were. If you're doing an in-person usability test, it's really a good idea, as with your initial user interviews, to actually record the session. So recording the audio and recording the video would be really great as well to show, to be able to observe how the user is interacting with your product. That's a really good idea. And the advantage of in-person usability testing is you can monitor nonverbal feedback. Right? There's a lot of psychological studies that show that a huge majority of communication is actually nonverbal. So there's kind of physical cues, gestural cues, body language, and all those kinds of things that you are picking up on in the context of being present with someone where you can read all those cues. So that's really a kind of a good advantage of in-person usability testing. And the other part of it as well is that because of that immediacy, it's often easier to assist the user and clarify tasks or questions that they might have about the task, about the testing process, and all those kinds of things. The other pro for in-person usability testing is that it's good for longer sessions where you're seeking more in-depth responses. Now, remote usability testing actually, interestingly, over 2020, because of all the kind of crazy COVID stuff that's gone on, is actually the majority of testing that's happening at the moment, has been happening over the last year or two, has been remote testing. And the platforms have all risen to the occasion. There's all sorts of fantastic platforms now that are much more robust than pre-COVID. So remote usability testing actually moving forward is probably going to be a pretty standard part of the usability testing process. And as with any online activity, ensuring that you have a reliable internet connection is pretty important to be able to conduct high fidelity and seamless usability testing. And another important thing is to be able to run your session in an accessible software program, and preferably something that has a built-in recording function. So you can actually do remote usability testing with products like Zoom or Skype, Microsoft Teams. All of these kinds of tools are currently used by UX professionals for this purpose. Often it's more convenient to be able to do remote testing, particularly if you need to reach a target audience who are very specialized, and so you need to draw upon maybe a more global audience, where your product is used in lots of different kind of markets. For example, if you're designing an app that's going to be used in China, then you obviously need to have people who are representative of that target audience, and it may not be cost efficient for you to fly to China to conduct a couple of usability tests. So remote testing is really the way to go for those kinds of things. And it's good for shorter sessions and for looking for quick data. So these are some of the kind of pros and cons. Now, in terms of your assessments, the majority of you will probably be using primarily in-person usability testing, but I envisage that there will be instances where you need to use remote testing as well. Now, there are kind of three phases of the usability test and three aspects that you need to consider while you're kind of setting up and designing and creating a usability test. There's the pre-test screening, which happens before the test even happens. There's the actual in-test time, so during testing, and then there's the post-test questions and analysis that you undertake. So these kind of 3 stages encompass all those aspects of the usability test. So as you can see from here in the screening section, that's where you're asking the screening questions and you're selecting your usability test participants. As you did in your initial user testing early on in the discovery phase of your project, it's really important to select people who are representative of your target audience, because then you're actually going to get data that's meaningful to you. Because if you don't do that, then you're just getting a bunch of randoms who may, they may align with your target audience, but they may not, and then you run the risk of getting information that's not necessarily valid or doesn't have any kind of real conversion value to you. Now, during the actual usability testing itself, usually it runs for somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes. This is quite typical in industry. At the start of the usability test, as you did with your user interviews that you would have done, you kind of need to introduce the context of why you're doing this thing and what's happening, outline your goals to the participant. And then during the usability test, you actually need to ask the user to perform specific tasks. So for example, telling them to navigate and do something or to book something. We'll dive into more detail about how to craft the tasks and what are sort of more efficient ways to do that as well. While the user's performing the tasks or trying to undertake those tasks, that's the point where you make observations about how effectively the user is able to complete those tasks. Now, that mostly, as I'll elaborate later on, involves you sitting quietly and observing, okay? Trying not to sort of interrupt the flow of the user. After the testing is completed and the user has either successfully or unsuccessfully completed the tasks, that's when you ask questions about their experience. So ask them to reflect on the thing that they've just done, specific kind of pain points that they had in there. Again, we'll dive into more detail about that later on in the lecture. And again, all throughout this process, you need to be taking notes. Okay? So that's really important because there are things that when you go back to listen to the recording or watch the recording, there are subtle cues that you might have missed. So it's really important to just sort of be making notes as you go throughout that process. Now, the screening part for a usability test is really the point where you're filtering your participants to make sure that they're the right ones. And then once you find the right ones, then those are the ones that you carry into the real testing. Okay? So screening helps you to filter potential test participants to make sure that they are appropriate and reflective of your target audience. And that's something that's really important. You always need to try and make sure that as far as possible, the people that you're testing with are reflective of the target audience, because those are the people that you're trying to reach. And so if you can get some insight into their psychology and some insight into their thinking about the processes and the product, then that's actually going to help you to design a better product. So screening questions could be demographic or behavioral in nature. They should be crafted to identify participants who are reflective of your target audience or maybe specific user groups within that audience. And to really help you determine whether each participant possesses the right knowledge, the right experience to provide valuable insights into your work. So maybe the target audience that you're looking at is a particular age group and a particular demographic. You might have found people who are that age group or that demographic, but it's also important to ascertain, does this person have enough tech experience or knowledge, for example, or tech experience and knowledge that's representative of the type of people that I am targeting with my app or my website. Using an online survey can be a really efficient way to screen participants, or if you sort of know the people personally, to kind of make your choices based on that understanding as well. In a professional UX setting, obviously you're not going to have the ability to know all the people that you might encounter, so having a kind of a survey to screen participants is a really important tool to leverage. Now at this point, identifying non-reflective or irrelevant participants is really important because you need to exclude them from your actual usability test process. For the usability test, consider approaching participants from the user interviews you conducted in the discovery phase, especially if they were pre-screened. So basically, if you, early on in your discovery phase of your project, you've identified, let's say, 5 people that you thought were representative, you can use them again. That's totally fine, right? For that initial phase and then for now as well. Now, here are some examples of screening questions. You might ask something like, how old are you? Is this person within the age range of potential users? In your cases with the app briefs that you're working with, this is probably not so relevant, but for those of you who then go into commercial UX design, this will become relevant. So asking a question like, what's your income level? So particularly if your app requires payment or there's a kind of a paywall, users who utilize those types of paid features typically exist within a certain income bracket and represent a particular demographic. So that might be an important thing for you to ascertain. How often does that person use a phone or their computer? If that person doesn't use their device very often, then maybe they're not the right people to engage with this kind of test in your real-world setting. But maybe they might be. So maybe you're creating an app that's specifically for people who don't use technology very much, and you need to make sure that your app is highly usable, really intuitive. Then in that case, it might be something that's relevant. So these are some examples of screening questions that you might want to consider in your process. Now, what should you test when you do a usability test? Now again, the context of this unit forms the foundation of other studies that you may progress onto in the UX space. So I want to kind of cover all of these ideas so that you know what's in the landscape, even though you're not going to necessarily be doing all of them. So the first thing is to test existing designs. So a very common thing to do is to, you might be tasked to redesign an existing website, for example. And if that is what your goal is, then it makes a lot of sense to do some usability testing of the existing site. Particularly identifying top tasks or the main kinds of tasks that people are going to use that website or that app for. These are the reasons that people go to that website or that use that app in the first place. So testing those tasks and how efficiently and effectively they are able to complete those tasks is really important. Identified pain points. So pain points, based on analytics maybe that you found, or from support channels that your business runs, or maybe from direct user feedback where they said, this part of the app is really hard to use or counterintuitive, and trying to really hone in on those pain points so that you can address them. Or maybe you're doing an existing test on an existing design for a feature that previously wasn't tested or a section that previously wasn't tested. So that's kind of a space that you might be considering. Now, for those of you who are obviously in the prototyping stage of your creating a new project based on a new brief, then that middle column of testing a new design is squarely the space that you're going to be working in. So for new designs, it's you're testing a new prototype. Maybe you're testing new features. Maybe you're testing a new design of an existing feature. Right? So maybe it could be something like you have a booking form or like a booking feature that you want to implement in your app, and you try two different ways of how that booking could be created. It's two slightly different workflows. That's what we call an A/B test, right? So it's comparing two different versions. So that could be one of the kinds of usability tests that you conduct. The iteration of a design, so you kind of improve your design and then you test it with someone or some users and try and work out, is this really genuinely more effective? Is this genuinely a better design outcome? And usually, obviously, a new design involves testing of a prototype rather than a fully functional or a fully featured app, because it costs a lot of money to actually develop a real app or to create a real website, whereas you can knock up a prototype really, really quickly in a prototyping tool like Figma or XD, as you guys have probably started to realize yourself. Another kind of column or band of testing that you might undertake is based on user type. So maybe you might do a test with your current target audience. Or maybe the product is trying to capture a new target audience. So you might have new user groups that you're exploring and needing to test with. Maybe you're focusing on just a particular user group within your demographic. So, for example, it could be like seniors or young adults, or depending on the type of app that you're developing, maybe you want to test with people who are either single or married. All those types of different segments will be clearly related to your target audience and the type of functionality that your app has. And then another one that's really important and becoming increasingly important is focusing on accessibility. So testing your app or your website to make sure that it's accessible to as wide a range of people as possible who have a wide range of abilities, for example, or who might be accessing your website or your app based on different platforms or based on maybe low vision or low hearing and any of those types of considerations. Now, accessibility is going to be it's already a really big thing, and it's getting more and more significant and important for product designers to think about. And I really think like over the next year or two, it's going to be super important. Google have started doing this thing with their rankings where they've included accessibility as a core part of the scoring and the ranking of a website. So moving forward, a lot of businesses have a very strong impetus to make sure that their websites are really accessible. Any questions so far? No? Feel free to stop me at any stage if you have any questions. Okay. Okay, so before you undertake your actual testing, it's really a good idea to come up with a testing plan. So, the kinds of things that you might have in your testing plan, as you can see from the screen here, is firstly outline the objectives of your study. So providing an articulation of why are you doing this? What are you hoping to get out of this testing process? Important sort of like nuts and bolts stuff is information about the schedule and location. What is your test date? When is your test date? What time is it? How many users will you be testing? How long is it going to be? Is each session going to run for? And you can see from this example here, there's a little heading for incentive. Now, if you're working in a commercial UX research space, when you're using up people's time to get their insights like this, people want to be remunerated. Like no one wants to, spend an hour out of their day to do something for free. So it's really important to offer a kind of incentive. So that might be like a cash incentive or a gift card or something like that. Obviously, in the case of student assignments, you're not going to be able to necessarily have that luxury. Maybe you can offer to buy people a coffee or something nice like that. Maybe that kind of thing is a good enough incentive. You need to have an indication of who your target users are. So you might want to specify, that your participants maybe must have at least a minimum of 1 year experience using the web. So in this particular example here, they said that because the website is in English, the person needs to be fluent in English. And they cannot be from a tech background. So, they can't be from computer hardware, software, marketing industries. Now, obviously, your participants that you choose for your particular project need to be crafted and aimed towards your project. So this is just obviously a very generic kind of template. It's not meant to be representative of all the kind of target audiences or target users that you might be using. And then finally, devices. So how are you going to be testing? For those of you who are working on app designs in Figma, you will be testing ideally on your mobile. So you can download so all of the major prototyping apps have got a kind of mobile testing component, which is brilliant. So XD and Figma both have it, where you can actually test your prototype on your device, which is awesome. You can test them on web browsers as well. And if you share that URL with anyone, they can see your project in real time and be able to interact with it and get a sense of what it will feel and look like. So the other thing to consider is unmoderated versus moderated tests. Now, in your case, based on the kind of university scenario, you're actually going to be running moderated testing, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview to let you know that unmoderated testing exists as well. So specifically thinking about moderated testing, it basically involves facilitator presence. So that could be either someone in person, like the facilitators there in person, with the person who's the test participant, or it could be online. But the point is that it's in real time. Okay? The observation of test participants happens in real time, but it's also usually recorded via screen sharing and or other recording tools, because you need to, as a researcher, be able to go back and look at that data, see if there's other things that maybe you missed the first time around. Usually involves more upfront time and resource costs when you conduct a moderated test, with fewer test participants for a time period, because it's sort of more time intensive. So let's say, for example, if you had 2 days to do rounds of testing, in moderated testing, you might only get through, 8 to 10 participants, whereas if you use an unmoderated system, which I'll talk about more in a minute, you might be able to get through 30 people, for example. So unmoderated tests are basically where the facilitator is not present. Instead, the testing is actually carried out by an automated service, like a website, or like usually it's web-based, like a web-based tool. The interactions are usually recorded by the service, such as like recorded with a video, and the UX researcher will usually view that video post-testing. So popular services include things like UserZoom, Hotjar, UserBrain, DScout, Validately, Usalytics, TryMyUI. And usually with these services, the way it works is you upload your website or your app or prototype to the web. That service will share the link to that prototype or to that website, and then people will access your prototype, and that website that's acting as the sort of mediator in the middle will capture things like, how many times does someone click on that button? How many minutes are people spending on this particular part of your app or your website versus this? Where are their clicks focused on? That kind of thing. So those kinds of analytics, will give you insights into how people are using your service, but maybe not necessarily why they're doing it. So that's why a moderated kind of a testing process can yield those kinds of insights that are much richer. There's a higher kind of a bandwidth as well.
It's kind of qualitative versus quantitative.
Yeah, in many ways it is. That's right. Yeah, but you can also, because you're recording it in an unmoderated setting, you can actually, watch the videos and make sort of qualitative assumptions based on the way that someone has interacted with a particular product. Particularly like if they go back and forth between screens, that's a really good example of someone who's unsure about the navigation and they're trying to find their way. Now, because of the nature of unmoderated testing, it involves less upfront cost and resources for a UX researcher. But because you have to look at everything post-test period, it requires a bit more time after the fact. But also because it's unmoderated, you can actually get through more test participants in the same time period, as I've mentioned, because you basically send out a whole bunch of links to people, and then they just go, and then they can access your service through that particular link. Now, when you set your tasks, this is a really, really important part of the actual testing process. The tasks that you set for your participants to do. Really, the best way to do it is to set directed tasks for participants that are focused and answer-orientated. These types of tasks direct your participants to achieve a particular goal with measurable success. Now, ideally, these tasks should be high level and represent an end-to-end activity. I'm going to give you some very specific examples in a minute to clarify what this means. But essentially, you need to be specific about the goal of the task and avoid telling participants how they should achieve that goal. The ease with which they complete the task will provide you with insights into how effectively your interface or your design or the information organization, the information architecture of your product supports users. So for example, here's an example. If you're, for example, designing a website for a mobile company like Optus, you might run a task that instructs them to order a new mobile phone plan that allows data sharing within a family and provides free incoming and outgoing calls or texts. So essentially, you're setting them this challenge. You're saying, jump onto this website and do this thing. Okay, so that's one example. Maybe you're designing an app or a website for like an IT company, and you set the task for the user to find the phone number for the support department. It could be something as simple as that. Now, that's just one task amongst many that you would ideally set. Another thing that you could do is maybe if you're designing a website for a charity organization or an NGO or something like that, and you've been set the kind of research goal to find out why is it that people are not donating or engaging with this organization as much over the last year since the website's been redesigned, for example. And then you might set a task that says, okay, so list 2 things that give you either confidence or concerns about the integrity of this company or this organization. So then that becomes a very useful task. Right? It's sort of a bit more open-ended, but really insightful for you as a researcher to get the kind of insights that you need. Maybe if you're doing an app for a gym, right? Your task that you set, one of the tasks could be to instruct a participant to book a recurring session for a group yoga class. Now that obviously will have a lot of resonance with some of you who are undertaking briefs like that. Now things that you shouldn't do, and actually these are very common mistakes that new UX researchers make. The first thing is to avoid leading participants through tasks in a way that biases the study. So it's really important, even though a user might feel stressed or unclear about how to do something, don't give them step-by-step answers to the solution, okay? And don't direct them to specific interface elements or give excessive hints until and unless they get absolutely stuck. Because that part of the process of them working through that cognitive friction and trying to find the right way to do something is actually part of the testing process and really insightful information for you as a designer. Avoid overly leading task instruction. So here's a really good example of a problematic task description that on the face of it might seem like it's really good, but actually it's not very ideal. So the first thing is to tell the user, okay, so navigate to the products section and then click on the smartwatches and fitness bands thing, then click on the filter tab to choose GPS enabled, then press the compare button to see how the Samsung Gear Watch compares with the Apple Watch Series 6. So that might be like, you're an IT or like a tech retailer and you're trying to find out how easy it is for people to navigate your website, compare the products that they want to use, that they want to buy. And if you give a prescription like that, then you're essentially giving the entire part of the process away. Because people have different mental models about how things should be organized and categorized, and that's actually an important part of information architecture, where you put things, what you name those things, and your usability testing will help you to inform pain points maybe that people have, that maybe you as a designer have specific terminology that you've used, but other people don't use those terminologies, and then they can't, as a result, because they're thinking with their own mental models, they can't find the thing that they want to find. So a more effective task description for that kind of a similar thing is you might say to the user, okay, your task or your scenario is that you want to buy a smartwatch from this particular website, and you're sort of deciding between the Samsung Gear or the Apple Watch Series 6. Now identify which one provides a better cost to feature proposition, and I want you to buy that product. So you're essentially telling them to go through the steps and steps that are actually really representative of stuff that you genuinely might do. I mean, any of you who are interested in online shopping have probably over the last week or two done something very similar to that process anyway, comparing two products and then thinking about which one you want to buy and then buying it. So it's a very reflective kind of a task. Now, when you're observing the test tasks, there are some kind of key areas that you should be thinking about. The first thing is this area of usability. Which things are easy for people to do and which things are hard for them to do, and why in either case? That's the kind of questions you're trying to answer. As the user tries to undertake the task, observe what appears to be understandable to them and what appears not to be understandable to them, and why. What are the pain points that are causing that friction? The important thing to do and to keep in mind while you're observing is to make a note of that. Like if you see someone struggling with something, don't interrupt and don't intervene. Wait for them to kind of see if they can resolve it themselves. And only if they come to you and they say to you, oh, look, I'm really stuck, then can't talk to them about it. Otherwise, make a note of it and actually come back to it after your testing is done. So in the post-test, which I'll talk about more in a second as well, or a couple of minutes anyway. The other thing that you want to test is findability. And this is basically when the user knows that something is there, or there's a particular function or features there, see if they can find that thing. So when you're testing, essentially you want to direct users to use a particular feature without giving them the exact name of that feature, see if they can find it. So that's what findability is about. An example of that might be, you've just received your new smartwatch you ordered from Samsung, but you're struggling to set it up correctly. Find the info on the Samsung site that you need to help you with that setup. So you haven't told them, go and look up the operation manual or the user manual, but essentially that's what it is. And so you're trying to see if they can work out, because that again is a problem that's probably a common issue for many people who are buying a new product and maybe not familiar with how to use it. And interestingly, I don't know if you've noticed this, a lot of consumer products that you buy nowadays, they're not putting the manual in anymore. It's like an online manual because they can update the manual, all sorts of stuff like that. So this is actually really good and representative kind of a task to set if that's a scenario that you're working with. Another thing that's a really useful thing to be considering is discoverability. And there's a slight difference between discoverability and findability. Discoverability means maybe they don't know that the thing is there even to begin with, right? So in findability, they know and they're pretty sure that such a thing is there and they need to find it. Discoverability is they don't know whether something is there. Maybe they haven't even thought of it. This is a tricky one to test for. And essentially, when you're testing for it, you don't specifically tell users about the feature, but instead, you set a task that's kind of related, and in the task, you hint for them that maybe they need this thing. So here's an example. So for example, if you are working for a travel website maybe, and you're doing some UX research about this, you might set the task to say, okay, so book a flight on this travel portal. But keep in mind that when you do your booking, you might need the flexibility to reschedule or to get a refund if your chosen flight dates are impacted because of unexpected COVID travel restrictions, for example. Now, the above, that task might prompt people to think about travel insurance, but you haven't said that word, travel insurance, right? But a lot of travel portals will, at the stage of when you're booking it, offer you a little tick box that says something like, do you want travel insurance? And that's the kind of thing that you're trying to discover in this case, whether they see that option there and whether they think about it, okay? So whether they discover that option. Any questions about observing the test tasks and these three areas that are really useful to focus on? No? Okay. Now, after the participants have completed the tasks, there's another set of questions that you need to consider and ask them, and set enough time aside in your schedule to follow up with them immediately after the test is finished. So while you're still there with them and they've just used your app or your website, for example, you should also follow up on any observations that you noted while they were doing the task, and things that you didn't mention because you didn't want to break the flow of the way that they were using the app or the website, for example. So some useful questions that you might ask is, say something like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate the user-friendliness of this app? And you might tell them a higher number means better. So 5 means it's really user-friendly, 1 means it's really terrible. Now, having a scale like this is actually quite a useful thing to ask people, because everybody's got a different kind of very subjective perspective on how easy or hard something is. If all you said is, do you think this is user-friendly, yes or no? Some people might say yes, some people might say no, and it's not really insightful. Usually when you ask a question like this and you get a number, hopefully with enough people testing, you might start to see the numbers land, either in the lower end of the range or maybe higher end of the range, and then finding out why did you rate it like this? So that's kind of a useful question to ask. Another one that you might ask is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how effectively did the app layout help you to complete your tasks? Or you could, a variation on that could be the way and the places where information are organized in the app or the website. Does that seem logical to you? On a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate it? Another really useful question that would be, I think, fairly applicable across the board is asking them, how would they recommend that the app design be improved to better support certain tasks, or to better support the main task that you're investigating. Something else that you might say is, I noticed that when you were doing the task, you moved back and forth between a couple of screens sort of continuously. Can you tell me why you did that? So picking up on observations that you made, but not interrupt that you didn't bring up at the time that they were doing the testing because you didn't want to interrupt the flow. Another nice one is, if you could change one thing about the app, what would it be and why? And not always focusing on the negative, you should ask the question, what did you actually like about the app? What was the best thing that you liked about the app? Because sometimes people have a tendency to keep iterating, and then you swap out a feature or you change something that actually was working really well for you before. So that's an important thing to think about. It's not always just looking for pain points all the time, but finding where the strengths are and capitalizing and building on those strengths. Now, here are some really useful tips to approach your usability testing. The first thing is that I want you to remember that you're actually testing the digital product. You're not testing the participant. A lot of people, particularly if they haven't been involved with much usability testing before, will assume that you're testing how tech savvy they are or how good they are at doing something. And you need to reassure them to say, actually, this is not about you. I'm trying to work out whether there are some issues with the digital product that I'm creating. And so I need you to approach the whole testing process with the philosophy that if the participant has trouble completing a task, regard it as a problem with the UX design, not an issue with the participant. Does that sort of make sense? So it's about the design and it's not about the person. Reassure them about this from the start of the testing. Now, the other thing to remember is that you're testing the digital product, not your design skills. So a common error or issue that novice designers have is that they can't be objective. They feel like their ego is tied to the design. So this is why one of the reasons why in formal testing, the observer and the facilitator will usually be different individuals, and also they will not be individuals who are involved in the design process, because you need that objectivity to be able to look at the design and say, yep, that didn't work, it needs to be changed and improved in this way. So when you're undertaking your usability testing, try to be as objective as possible as with the testing as you can be. Don't try and defend problematic aspects of the design if the person comments about it. Just quietly make a note of it for you to kind of iterate and refine upon it. Does that sort of make sense? And it's sort of similar, I guess, to when you receive feedback. Even if you kind of don't agree with the feedback or whatever, it's not about defending it because you're not being attacked. No one's making a judgment about your ability to design or your ego or any of those things. So stepping back from that process allows you to look at things, hopefully in a more objective way, and design a better version of the thing that you're designing. While they're undertaking the tasks, encourage the participant to speak their thoughts aloud in real time. Now, this is actually kind of weird. Most people will feel really weird doing this, but actually it provides you as a UX researcher with valuable insights into that person's thought processes, their pain points, and their frustrations. So let me give you an example of this, right? So let's say, I've got my app here, and you give the app to the person to test. And essentially what you should ask them to do is to explain to them, it'd be really valuable and insightful for me if you can kind of talk through the processes of what you're doing and what you're thinking. And so then it might sound or look like this, where the person's like, yep, I just opened the app up and I can see the splash screen. Oh, that's a really cute animation there. Okay, so I've just swiped left and I've gone into the home screen. Oh, that's weird. I just pressed the button and it didn't really respond. Oh no, it's responding now, okay. It's just a little bit slow. Okay, so now I've gone to, I need to complete this task, and I'm going to the About screen, and I found that. So essentially, they're kind of talking through the experience, and there's all sorts of insights in that talking through, that loud narration, that you're missing if they're sitting there quietly and using it. Does that make sense? So you need to encourage this, and it feels weird, but actually it's super useful to you. And after about a minute of doing that, they'll just get used to it, and it'll be fine. And also, it provides you with kind of cues to follow up on later on, because then you'll say, oh yeah, I noticed that when you press the home screen, that you were a bit surprised that there was a kind of animation there and it lagged a little bit. Can you tell me more about that? And they'll go, they might say something like, oh yeah, the animation was cool, but it happened too slowly, and I didn't realize, I wasn't expecting it there, and it seems a bit distracting, to be honest. That's really insightful information for you. Something that you thought like a micro interaction that was maybe really useful or really cool, someone thinks, oh, that's superfluous. Okay, so that's kind of good to approach it in that way. The other thing that's really hard to do is to try to stay silent when the user is undertaking the tasks. Focus on observing them. And it's really important for you to let them know beforehand that your goal is to see how they interact with the product, and that your aim is to mostly be quiet and to support them if they get really, really stuck, but not to kind of hold their hand through the process. Okay. Any questions about the usability testing tips? Cool. So after completing your usability testing, you will create a usability testing report that essentially collates the key details around things like your testing methodology, what your findings are, and your recommendations. Now, this will feel familiar, from another report that you might have collated, the quick findings report in your initial research. This is similar insofar as you're distilling your findings, but it's got a slightly different format and a different way of approaching it. There's not really a single standardized format for this kind of thing, but I really want to encourage you to at least structure your report under these headings. So starting with an executive summary. An executive summary basically is like 3 or 4 really succinct sentences that say, this is what I found. Okay, so it's just a very brief way to recap what your findings are. The second thing is to state what your usability testing goals were. So, when you're planning your usability test, you need to kind of identify what you're trying to get out of it, listing those goals there. Identifying what your results were, talking about bugs and issues that were found during the testing, recommendations and action items. Okay? And then finally, the appendix, which collates the actual raw recordings that you might have. So in the case of when you actually go to do the usability testing, as with your initial interviews that you did where you ask and you get permission to record the participants, ask for permission to record the participants here as well, and think about recording video in this case, because the way that they interact with the product will be really useful. So you might want to either set up a camera or something over their shoulder so that you can have a view of how they interact with the screen. That might be a useful thing to do. And then you might include a link to that video recording, either to a Dropbox link or Google Drive or something like that. Here's an exemplar of that format. It's the same exemplar that's included in the assignment 3 brief, so I encourage you to check it out. It's just a really nice, neat way to kind of lay out all of that information. Now here are some really great testing resources that I encourage you to check out. Steve Krug, who wrote a really influential and seminal book on UX called Don't Make Me Think. He's created a whole bunch of great resources in the usability testing space that are free for you to check out. So the first one is a kind of instruction set for test observers. In a formal usability test scenario, as I mentioned before, there are usually 2 different individuals allocated to be the facilitator and the observer. In the context of your university study, generally speaking, you're probably going to take on both roles. So my suggestion is, download those instructions and use it to inform your own approach to being an observer and maintaining that objectivity as an observer. The second resource, which is really useful, is a briefing script. Before commencing your usability test, as I mentioned before, it's important for you to brief your test participants, give them an overview of the process, explain what you're trying to achieve with your testing process, and basically put them at ease so that they know what to expect. This script is a really nice starting point, and I encourage you to download it, customize it to your own brief and your own approach. And the last thing is a pretty cool one that's actually kind of useful in life in general, I would argue maybe. It's a document that he calls Things a Therapist Would Say.
The top one, how does that make you feel?
It is actually. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's like that in that space. While the participant is doing the tasks, to maintain neutrality, it's really important for you to kind of say a few or reiterate a few kind of ideas. But there are sort of specific ways that you can phrase that to make the person feel supported. And usually those are kinds of non-directive things that a therapist typically says to their patient. So this is a kind of a handy chart of permissible phrases. It's also might be a good way to talk to your partner or a friend when you're in a point of like conflict or tricky situation. It's sort of got all sorts of life applicable scenarios. So anyway, check it out there. And then at the bottom, there's a link for more useful resources from Steve Krug, including an example of a video recording of a usability test. I mean, the video is a bit old. I haven't included it here. There's some stuff that you might find useful there. So just to kind of give you insight, so check those out. Now to kind of wrap up, usability testing is the process of determining just how efficiently and effectively the user is able to achieve their tasks. The purpose of usability testing is to test the digital product, not test the user. And also, remember, it's not testing you, okay? So you are not the digital product. It's not saying anything about your abilities or your capabilities. User testing can be done in person or remotely. It can be moderated or unmoderated. And as the facilitator, it's really important for you to listen and observe. And indeed, probably in life, that's probably good advice, to listen and observe before you do stuff. There are 3 phases to the usability test. The screening phase, where you're trying to work out and filter out people who are maybe not relevant, and only continuing your test with people who are representative and relevant related to your target audience. There's the in-test part of while you're doing the testing phase, with related questions and related approaches. And then there's the post-testing phase. So after they've completed their tasks, questions that you might have and discussions that you might follow up with that person while they're still there. Now, the final really, really critical step is to use your findings to iterate and improve your UX design. That's really the purpose of this UX research, is gaining insights so that you can make a better version of your product.